The next contribution should come from Jamie. Are you ready and willing, James?
If you would like to make me a co-host, that would be fantastic, Mike.
Wonderful.
Right, can you see me full screen?
We can, yes.
Fantastic. Okay, great. Right, good evening, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jamie Wildman, and I'm studying the reintroduction, ecology, and history of the Chequered Skipper butterfly in Rockingham Forest and England, and I'm studying my PhD at the University of Northampton in collaboration with Butterfly Conservation, and very gratefully receiving the financial support over the past 3 years from the Cambs and Essex branch of BC. So without further ado, I'm sure a vast majority of you know about the Chequered Skipper already, but for those of you who don't, there's a very, very small golden brown butterfly. The male is only 25 millimeters in size typically, and the female is around 31 millimeters. Historically, according to a lot of the historic reports and documentation I've uncovered, it occupied a similar habitat to what we see on the continent and up in Scotland: deciduous woodland rides and glades, things like woodland margins, hedgerows, limestone grassland, as I've found in Luffenham Heath in Rutland, some fenland and heathland habitats as well. Its historic food plants were false brome, the Brachypodium sabbaticum, and tall grass, the Brachypodium pinnatum. And I believe there's some link with the growing abundance of the tall grass to the myxomatosis outbreak that occurred in 1953. And there is a suggestion that although the Chequered Skipper is somewhat synonymous with things like the Brachypodium sabbaticum and tall grass, and even the wood small reed Calamagrostis apigeus, Frohawk experimented with breeding larvae in 1914 on hairy brome, Bromus ramosus, to some success. So it seems like the butterfly could be quite adaptable and essentially could adopt any broadleaf grass in order to survive through to adulthood. In nectars on bugle, bluebell, marsh thistle, it has a strong reputation and connection to any purple and blue flowering plants, but it also has been known, especially in Rockingham Forest, since the reintroduction to nectar on bramble as well, which is white. And some of the behaviours that the historic Chequered Skipper in England exhibited, it was very, very similar to what we know of the Chequered Skipper's males, typically them adopting very high vantage points on blades of grass to very angrily and territorially defend their habitats from other passing Lepidoptera and skippers alike. So I've done a ton of work over the past year collecting what I believe is over about 4,000 records about the Chequered Skipper in England, and that's up from about 270 odd that I originally had access to through the Butterflies for the New Millennium data set. And this, after we've seen the timeline, because I've skipped the slide, this is what the English distribution looks like when it's mapped out at 5 kilometer resolution scale. So what we have on the left are, as I say, 5 kilometer dots representing the distribution of the Chequered Skipper in England from 1856, the date of the last record on each of these very blue pips, to 1976, the much warmer colors on the map. So this is essentially what I have collated from all of the thousands of records I've brought together. This is pretty much the ultimate distribution map of records that we have of the Chequered Skipper in England now. It's effectively confirmed what we know of the historic range of the species, but it's infilled a lot of the distribution too. So we haven't seen, as a consequence of me uncovering all these thousands of new records, the Chequered Skipper expanding wildly northwards or eastwards or southwards. It's mostly concentrated still to Northamptonshire, Cambridgeshire, Leicestershire and Rutland, and Lincolnshire, with a few isolated records older, further south toward Bedfordshire and so forth. But there is something of a suggestion, and I've cut a slide from this evening because I feel like I could have rabbited on about it for about 15 or 20 minutes, but we can cover it in questions afterwards, that there was potentially a series of colonies along the south coast, because you can see a lot of these older dots representing periods in the 1800s, all the way across from Devon, Dorset, Kent and so forth. So there's an indication there was possibly a series of colonies there, perhaps before records really began and before the Chequered Skipper was really uncovered and started to be studied. But what I've done on the map on the right is I've tried to kind of cut away a lot of the fat and just include the vice counters that we have over 10 records for, and 10 records that meet my quality criteria, which I can elucidate a little later on if necessary. But it's essentially just about, I've just included records that have things like full location data, full and clear site data, a specific time of a specimen that I've pulled up. So it's things like that really, but that just presents a really concentrated viewpoint of where the Chequered Skipper was historically in England before it was rendered extinct in 1976. I'm going to skip back to the timeline because I've touched on it already, but it was first defined as Cartilacephalus palaemon by Pallas in 1771. And the first record I have in my database is from 1798 in Clapham Park Wood in Bedfordshire. Now, Bedfordshire is not something that we really that readily associate with the Chequered Skipper now. We think about Rockingham Forest, we think about Cambridgeshire, we think about Lincolnshires, and as I've come to discover through the help of a wonderful entomologist and historical researcher on Lepidoptera called Adrian Russell, that there is a suggestion that the species was much more abundant in Leicestershire and Rutland than we previously knew about. So if anything, the species has kind of pushed further west, and that's really the only direction that we know it have to have done so in significant numbers. Of most significance to the Cairns and Essex branch is the sightings at Castor Hanglands. The first one, the earliest record I have, is from 1823. And if we fast forward just over 100 years, we have most records from any given year at Castor Hanglands in 1932. So that was pretty much peak abundance, just going purely from the records that I've collated. And it's only 42 years after that, I'm sorry, 42 years after that, in 1974, that we have the very last record from Castor Hanglands. So the first record in 1823 and the last in 1974. And this is only 2 years prior to the last ever sightings of the Chequered Skipper in England, which were at Lougham Heath and Ringhaw on the same day, June 6th, 1976. Now, there's a bit of an interesting point about this date, 1976. It's in all the literature. It's commonly known that that was the last date that the Chequered Skipper was in England. That was its extinction year. But that date was determined in 1975 through a collective including Lynn Farrell. The last sighting they made of the Chequered Skipper in England was in 1975, and they made the decision to declare the butterfly extinct on that basis because they thought that was pretty much it. That was before any of the sightings came about in 1976. So effectively, if you were to ask me in any private conversation, the extinction date for the Chequered Skipper is 1977 now, because we have a series of sightings from 1976 that essentially using the same rationale that Lynn Farrell and co. employed in 1975 to determine extinction in 1976. The sightings in 1976 suggest that the extinction was actually at the very earliest in 1977. And although I don't have any evidence for it, I do believe there's a good possibility that a couple hung on in a few sites late into the 1970s, but who's to say really? It's just up to speculation in your imagination. And then fast forward 42 years to Rockingham Forest, and we've had a fantastic and so far very successful reintroduction at landscape scale in collaboration with a lot of Belgian authorities and conservation organisations over there, and an enormous number of volunteers that have so far made the reintroduction to RF a great success. So the key data sources of all these records I've collated, over 4,000 of them. You can see here on the right-hand side, our first figure, over 2,100 specimens have come from museums. So I've essentially taken all of these specimens that I've found at museums across the country, over 40 institutions in all, and basically consider them as records, as you would do any casual sighting that you make when you jot down the date that you've seen the butterfly, where you've seen it at, and so forth. So each of those specimens has represented one sighting essentially. So you can see just the enormous wealth of information that comes from museums versus any other source. And there are a number of unpublished texts that are held within museum collections as well, private diaries by chaps like John Keith Bates and Don Tozer, amateur entomologists who lived in Rutland in the 1930s to the 1970s, and they contained a lot of references to sightings within their diaries. So I've included those as well. Things like published texts. Lynn Farrell's report contains over 300 records of the Chequered Skipper in England. And there's also a significant number of Chequered Skippers that are held in private collections. Clive Pratt's being a specific note down in Wiltshire, because his collection has over 319 Chequered Skipper specimens in it. But as you can see, this blue bar, this yellow bar, this green bar, and this grey bar collectively far exceed the number of existing records that we knew about through the Butterflies for the New Millennium data set. So by an order of magnitude, we've greatly enhanced the database that we have of historic Chequered Skipper sightings. And this is the breakdown. This is what it looks like across the country. Again, confirming that the strongholds that we already knew about, Northamptonshire, Cambridgeshire, the Lincolnshires, Leicestershire and Rutland and Huntingdonshire, and with a few isolating sightings elsewhere. And you can see the breakdown by the amount of specimens and the specific type, whether they're from the data set, museums, texts and published or otherwise. There are very few elsewhere in the country, but you can see that there's quite a significant amount of vice counties represented here, but with only a few that are particularly dominant, and Northamptonshire and Cambridgeshire, as one might expect, pretty much leading the way. And per site, congratulations, Cambs and Essex, Castor Hangland was the stronghold for the Chequered Skipper in England. That is indisputable now. You look at the amount of records that come from museum specimens, from published texts and so forth, compare that to Firmin Woods, Wakeley Woods, it's far and away ahead of the pack. So Castor Hanglands really was the dominant site across England without comparison. There's a lot of, it's so difficult. Again, I've had to break down this presentation into a very simple form because I could go on endlessly about how you attribute records that are assigned to places like Corby and Oundle and Wansford, which are settlements, not sites, and connect some of those sightings to woodlands nearby. And in some cases, it's just absolutely impossible. And you just have to say, well, I'm going to leave that sighting on Corby as is written on the label, because there are just far too many candidate sites in close proximity, and you could not confidently ascribe them to any particular settlement or site. So that's why we've left some of them the way they are, but it's up to you really. Anybody who's looking at the data set might say, well, those Wansford sightings were actually from Old Sullerhay or something like that, or the Oundle ones were from Ashton Wild versus Firmin or something like that. So this, now we start to see, once we look at them by decade, look at them temporally, all these records that we've collated, and you can see again that we have a very significant spike around the middle of the 1900s, followed by a very precipitous decline. The highest number of records, the peak abundance of the Chequered Skipper in England was between 1940 and 1949. And it's very it's a very clear pattern of gradual climb and then very, very quick descent. And it's originally speculated that the descent happened in started to happen in the early 1960s, but I'm quite confident in saying now that it started to happen slightly earlier in the early 1950s. But you can see that there's something of almost an explosion, you could call it, in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, as I think collecting became more well-known about pastime and more people engaged within it, which is why we see more museum specimens coming about, and we'll see more private specimens coming collected. And then as collecting declines and we see significant collecting restrictions imposed from 1964 onwards on NNRs in the East Midlands, then you see the numbers of museum specimens and private specimens fall away quite dramatically and are replaced by a lot of references within published and unpublished texts. So R.E.M. Pilcher in 1961 said, "An insect in no apparent danger of extinction, but well worth some trouble to maintain in good numbers," in regards to the Chequered Skipper. This is only 15 years before it was rendered extinct. And in entomological terms, that is like a snap of the fingers. It happened so quickly, according to Pilcher and Lynn Farrell, and so many experienced researchers around that time, that it took them completely by surprise. So this decline, we had to kind of figure out what caused it. There's a lot of speculation that's gone on around coppicing, about coniferization, about degradation of habitat and habitat fragmentation and so forth. But the aim of this research, this tangent to my PhD study, was definitively identifying beyond any shadow of a doubt what caused the decline. I've used on figure 7 here above, this is the line graph from John Moore's PhD that he carried out on the Chequered Skipper reintroduction to Lincolnshire in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And that's his line graph from 2004. If you compare it to my one below, pretty comparable, right? It almost mirrors the climb, the ascendance, and then the precipitous decline that followed that. But you'll notice that my peak happened slightly earlier now, and the number of sites that I've got data for is about a twofold increase versus John Moore's. So you'll notice that, again, we have a very gradual ascent, and then around the 1945, 1949 period into the early 1950s, then it starts to fall away gradually. And then as we hit the late 1950s, then we hit a pretty sizable and sharp decline from there on until the eventual extinction date in 1976. So it suggests that something started to happen around that time that had a very, very sizable impact on the Chequered Skipper. You'll notice that the number of new sites being occupied never really picked up significantly until, again, this 1940s, 1950s period, where we see an increase in the number of new sites occupied by the Chequered Skipper, which again starts to fall away in tandem with the number of occupied sites as well. And we think, I'm pretty sure about this now, it pretty much confirms a lot of speculation around coppicing abandonment and the impact that this had on woodland structure. Once we saw coppicing abandoned en masse and replanting and infilling in woodland with high forest and conifers, with very, very little subsequent management, this resulted in a substantial decline in habitat quality that ultimately presented the death knell for the Chequered Skipper. So we've had this, I'll just pop back quickly. We've obviously got this decline that starts around the 1940s on my grass and John's, and that's also kind of representing this extinction trajectory here that's also around that time, around the late 1940s. So what we have on this graph is we take year zero, which is 1850, where we have all the remaining sites that I have data for represented in the data set. And as each one's last date passes, we basically strike it from the list. So this is why this number starts to decline. So the last site, for example, for Clapham Park Wood in Bedfordshire was in the 1850s, so that disappears, and that represents a plot. And it's the same for all the sites until there are none left and every last date has passed, which leads all the way down to 1976. But again, it happens in the late 1940s and around about the early 1950s. It's just a very, very sharp cliff all of a sudden that is not represented in any of the preceding decades. So something happened around that time, and it was specifically around that time that caused a decline. And it's not just the Chequered Skipper as well. This is something that was quite important to ascertain, is whether this decline in the Chequered Skipper, its loss from sites, was represented in any other UK species. And I've taken this table from Ray Collier's 1986 report on the status of butterflies at Bedford Purleys, Monkswood and Castor Hanglands. And you'll see in here, there are a lot of late 1950s, early 1960s records at these three sites, which is around the time that the Chequered Skipper started to disappear altogether. So there's a similar degree of habitat loss, habitat degradation that didn't just affect the Chequered Skipper, but affected other UK butterfly species too. So what we've effectively been able to determine that it was a consequence of the clear felling of medieval broadleaf woodland, coppicing abandonment and high forest conversion around the World War II period, 1939 to 1945, and a lot of this has been informed thanks to the very kind assistance of Nicola Orchard, who did a follow-up study in 2007, her MSc, using a lot of Peterkin and Harding's rocky and forest research that they conducted in the 1970s. Conifer afforestation as well. This tended to happen in the early 1900s, but there was also a lot of infilling with conifers around the middle of the century as well, which contributed again to rides shading over, the loss of nectar sources and the scrubbing up of rides. So what we have are the most significant players in gold here. And it seems also that a contributory factor that was also very significant in the grand scheme of things was agricultural intensification, this fragmentation of habitat across Northamptonshire and Cambridgeshire, which eventually resulted in the loss of a lot of marginal habitats like the woodland edges and hedgerows, and just relatively natural grassland as well. There's a suggestion that in Rutland, in Barrowden and Lees, which is near Luffenham Heath Golf Course, which was really the dominant site in the early 1970s for the Chequered Skipper, a lot of habitat around that golf course prior to the 1950s was grassland, was limestone grassland, which was dominated by Brachypodium pinnatum. which borders the golf course. But that was all ploughed up in the 1950s. Chequered Skipper was then seemingly confined to a lot of optimum habitat. And as soon as that optimum habitat started to degrade, the Chequered Skipper had nowhere else to go and declined and was then eventually rendered extinct. And there are minor factors at play as well, things like recreational development. Again, Loughlingham Heath, that was originally heathland, but was developed into a golf course. And it seemed like there was enough habitat there to sustain the Chequered Skipper through the 1950s and 60s and the 70s, until as a consequence of ride scrubbing up, or the rough scrubbing up 20 to 30 or so years after myxomatosis, the Chequered Skipper again lost suitable habitat there, and again had nowhere else to go and was rendered extinct. And I've got a couple of slightly more speculative contributory factors as well. There are a couple of extreme weather events in the 1959 period, the 1962-93 winter, things like droughts and so forth, that although they would not have had a sizable impact within themselves, if we're talking about very vulnerable populations of butterflies that are just clinging on, an extreme weather event might just be enough to push them over the edge and render the population unsustainable in the long run. And there are lots of accounts in the diaries of John Keith Bates and Don Tozer's diaries of collectors really just collecting as many butterflies as they possibly could. On one day in Wakeley Woods in, I think it was 1947, they collected 120 of 150 Chequered Skippers seen. Now, collecting within itself will not result in a loss of butterfly species, but if we're talking about vulnerable populations, again, that are just kind of clinging on, if it's a multitude of factors, if it's multifactorial, then collecting is just going to be that little, again, that little chink in the armor of the Chequered Skipper that contributed to its loss. So this is what we have, really. This is what all of this museum data has taught us, really, that it's given us a definitive time that the Chequered Skipper started to decline, and it's very, very precisely interwoven with a lot of changes in woodland management practices in the late 30s and the 1940s and 1950s, and resulted in ultimately the loss of the Chequered Skipper from England. So that's pretty much it. I've got a ton of references for you and a lot of acknowledgements. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jamie. That was great.